Hi students. In the following 3 lectures, we will be examining some of the main concepts of environmental health. We will be looking at some of the sources of environmentally related health issues such as viruses, bacteria, and protozoa, and other communicable diseases, particularly ones that have recently emerged such as Ebola and Zika. We will also be examining the major concepts of toxicology. Toxicology is a study of how external factors can adversely affect an organism or its organ systems. We will look at the major classes of toxins and review how these chemicals move through the environment, enter our bodies, and how our bodies respond to minimize the effects. Lastly, we will look at how we evaluate risk from environmental events and how we establish policies as a society to deal with the perceived and actual risks. So let's get started with the first lecture. This lecture will focus on the biological and chemical agents that can affect organisms and humans in particular. In this first lecture, we will be learning about how the environment and the organisms and chemicals that are in it can affect human, animal, and plant health. In particular, when you're done studying this material, you should be able to define environmental health, understand the largest risks to human health, define an emergent disease and explain why they are more frequent, and explain the concept of ecological health and disease. By definition, we are all ill to some extent. Likewise, we all can improve our health to live happier, longer, more productive, and more satisfying lives if we think about what we do. Health is more than just the absence of disease. Rather, health is a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being. Diet and nutrition, infectious agents, toxic substances, genetics, trauma, and stress all play roles in morbidity and mortality. Morbidity means illness, and mortality means death. The World Health Organization estimates that 24% of all global disease burden and 23% of premature mortality are due to environmental factors. Among children 0 to 14 years of age, deaths attributable to environmental factors may be as high as 36%. So, when we study environmental health, we are looking at those factors that can cause disease. These could be natural causes like exposure to a virus or a bite from a poisonous snake, but can also mean socially or culturally related health issues, such as alcohol or drug use. It can also involve the study of how technology impacts us, such as exposure to toxic wastes or industrial chemicals, or the use of cell phones or automobiles. This figure breaks down the major sources of environmental health risks into 5 major categories: infectious agents, trauma, pollution, toxins, and radiation. Probably the most significant source of environmental health risk is infectious agents, such as bacteria, protozoa, and viruses. These take a huge toll on human health. Pollution is another environmental health risk, which could include exposure to contaminated drinking water, breathing polluted air, or coming into contact with polluted soils. You may also experience risk from trauma, such as that associated with airplane accidents, car accidents, or slips and falls. Exposure to toxic substances is another environmental health risk, and this includes exposure to hazardous chemicals such as lead, mercury, household cleaners, or even smoke. The final category of health risk is radiation, which you might receive from an X-ray, from being in the sun, or living near a coal-burning power plant. In the past, health organizations have focused on the leading causes of death as the best summary of world health. Mortality data, however, fail to capture the impacts of non-fatal outcomes of disease and injury, such as dementia or blindness, on human well-being. When people are ill, work isn't done, crops aren't planted or harvested, meals aren't cooked, and children can't study and learn. Health agencies now calculate disability adjusted life years, DALYS, as a measure of disease burden. DALYs combine premature deaths and loss of a healthy life resulting from illness or disability. This is an attempt to evaluate the total cost of disease, not simply how many people die. In this figure, we see an example of disability-adjusted life years from infectious and parasitic diseases. Africa, parts of the Middle East, and also Southeast Asia are most impacted. The world is now undergoing a dramatic epidemiological transition. Chronic conditions, such as cardiovascular disease and cancer, no longer afflict only wealthy people. Progress in eliminating communicable diseases, such as smallpox, polio, and malaria, is allowing people everywhere to live longer. As Chapter 6 pointed out, over the last century, the average life expectancy worldwide has risen by about two-thirds. In some poorer countries, such as India, life expectancies nearly tripled in the 20th century. Although the traditional killers in developing countries, infections, maternal and perinatal or birth complications, and nutritional deficiencies still take a terrible toll, diseases such as depression and heart attacks that once were thought to occur only in rich countries are rapidly becoming the leading cause of disability and premature deaths everywhere. In this figure, we see the deaths per million persons from cardiovascular disease. What countries have the highest death rate? What have the lowest? Why do you think this variation exists? This table shows the leading causes of global diseases across the globe in 1990 and projected into 2020. In 1990, the leading causes of disease were pneumonia and diarrhea. Communicable diseases still account for one-third of all disease-related mortality. Looking forward into 2020, leading causes of disease are expected to be heart disease, depression, traffic accidents, and stroke. These are all conditions associated with the modern 21st century lifestyle. As noted in the last slide, emergent and infectious diseases are still the leading causes of death and account for one-third of all disease-related mortality. And these are not necessarily exotic diseases. Diarrhea, acute respiratory illnesses like SARS, mosquito-borne malaria, mosquitoes and tetanus kill millions of children every year in the developing world. Most of these deaths could be eliminated by improving attrition, sanitation, providing clean water for drinking and vaccinating children against the most common communicable diseases. However, politics often gets in the way of simple fixes. Many people in developing countries are suspicious of Western attempts to provide health care, inoculations, and improved sanitation. At least 3 million children die every year from easily preventable diseases. This billboard in Guatemala encourages parents to have their children vaccinated against polio, diphtheria, TB, tetanus, pertussis or whooping cough, and scarlet fever. Even in the United States, getting parents to vaccinate their children can be problematic. Some parents believe, erroneously, that vaccines can cause mental retardation or adversely affect their child. This has been debunked numerous times, although some pediatricians change the timing of some vaccines. A wide variety of pathogens or disease-causing organisms afflict humans, including viruses, bacteria, protozoans or single-celled animals, parasitic worms, and flukes. The greatest loss of life from an individual disease in a single year was the great influenza pandemic of 1918. Epidemiologists now estimate that at least one-third of all humans living at the time were infected, and that between 50 to 100 million died. Businesses, schools, churches, and sport and entertainment events were shut down for months. There were worries that the H1N1 pandemic that spread across the world in 2009 might sicken 2 billion people, kill up to 150 million, and bring the world economy to a standstill. Fortunately, it hasn't been nearly as bad, so far, as the 1918 strain. Influenza is caused by a family of viruses that mutate rapidly and move from wild and domestic animals to humans, making control of this disease very difficult. Similarly, cholera, which had been absent from South America for more than a century, reemerged in Peru in 1992. Some other examples include a new drug-resistant form of tuberculosis now spreading in South Africa, dengue fever, which is spreading throughout Southeast Asia and the Caribbean, and a new human lymphotropic virus, HTLV, which is thought to have jumped from monkeys into people in Cameroon who handled or ate bushmeat. These HTLV strains are now thought to infect 25 million people. More recently, we have seen outbreaks of emergent diseases such as Zika and Ebola, which caused great fear in the United States that these diseases would become established here. This figure shows some recent outbreaks of highly lethal infectious diseases. These include Legionnaire's disease, which is spread through air conditioning systems and is associated with iron-containing waters, dengue fever in Mexico, which is expected to travel into the United States as climate change increases temperatures in the southern United States, chikungunya fever, which translates to bent-over fever, originated off the coast of East Africa, but has recently migrated to the Caribbean and into Florida, where it's now established in Orlando. Why do you think super contagious organisms, like the ones we see here, are emerging in so many different places? West Nile virus shows how fast new diseases can travel. West Nile belongs to a family of mosquito-transmitted viruses that cause encephalitis, or brain inflammation. Although recognized in Africa in 1937, the West Nile virus was absent from North America until 1999, when it apparently was introduced by an imported bird or mosquito. The disease spread rapidly from New York, where it was first reported, throughout the eastern United States in only 2 years. Within 5 years, it was found almost everywhere in the lower 48 states. The virus infects 250 bird species and 18 mammalian species. In 2007, about 4,000 people contracted West Nile and about 100 died. Humans aren't the only ones to suffer from new and devastating diseases. Domestic animals and wildlife also experience sudden and widespread epidemics, which are sometimes called ecological diseases. We are coming to recognize that the delicate ecological balances that we value so highly and disrupt so frequently are important to our own health. Conservation medicine is an emergent discipline that attempts to understand how our environmental changes threaten our own health, as well as that of the natural communities on which we depend for ecological services. Although it is still small, this new field is gaining recognition from mainstream funding sources such as the World Bank, the World Health Organization, and the United States National Institutes of Health. Ebola hemorrhagic fever, for example, is one of the most virulent viruses ever known, killing up to 90% of its victims. In 2002, an outbreak of Ebola fever began killing humans along the Gabon-Congo border. A few months later, researchers found that 221 of the 235 western lowland gorillas that they had been studying in this area disappeared in just a few months. Many chimpanzees also died. Although the study team could find only a few of the dead gorillas, 75% of those tested were positive for Ebola, although researchers estimate that 5,000 gorillas died in this small area of the Congo. Extrapolating to all of Central Africa, it's possible that Ebola has killed 1/4 of all the gorillas in the world. It's thought that the spread of this disease in humans resulted from the practice of hunting and eating primates. The latest outbreak of Ebola in 2015 was shown to be the result of human exposure to bats, which are carriers of the disease. Funeral practices of West Africa, which involve close contact with the recently deceased, also helped spread this deadly disease. International efforts were required to halt the spread of the outbreak. An even more widespread epidemic is currently sweeping through amphibians worldwide. A disease called chytridiomycosis is causing dramatic losses or even extinctions of frogs and toads throughout the world. A fungus called Batrachochytrium dendrobatitis, causes the disease. It was first recognized in 1993 in dead and dying frogs in Queensland, Australia, and now is spreading rapidly, perhaps because the fungus has become more virulent or amphibians are more susceptible due to environmental change. Most of the world's approximately 6,000 amphibian species appear to be susceptible to the disease, and around 2,000 species have declined or even become extinct in their native habitats as part of this global epidemic. And another example of an ecological disease here in the United States is the white nose syndrome that affects bats in the northeastern United States. Many thousands of hibernating bats are dying in caves and abandoned mines in New York, Massachusetts, and Vermont from unknown causes. The most obvious symptom associated with the die-off is a white fungus encircling the noses of some, but not all, of the bats. This has led to the name white nose syndrome, which is actually a collection of related symptoms, including a fungus. It is not clear how this fungus alone can cause bats to die. However, impacted bats deplete their fat reserves months before their normal springtime emergence from hibernation and starve to death as a result. In recent years, health workers have become increasingly alarmed about the rapid spread of methicillin-resistant Staphylococcus aureus, or MRSA. Staphylococcus, or staph, is very common. Most people have at least some of these bacteria. They are a common cause of sore throats and skin infections, but usually they're easily controlled. This new strain, however, is resistant to penicillin and related antibiotics and can cause deadly infections, especially in people with weak immune systems. MRSA is most frequent in hospitals, nursing homes, and correctional facilities, and other places where people are in close contact. It's generally spread through direct skin contact. School locker rooms, gymnasiums, and contact sports are also sources of infections. Several states have closed schools as a result of MRSA. In 2006, the United States Centers for Disease Control and Prevention estimated that at least 100,000 MRSA infections in the United States resulted in about 19,000 deaths. Why have vectors such as mosquitoes and pathogens, bacteria, or malaria become resistant to pesticides and antibiotics? Part of the answer is natural selection and the ability of many organisms to evolve rapidly. Another factor is the human tendency to use control measures like antibiotics carelessly. Many doctors prescribe penicillin or other antibiotics just in case they might do some good. Similarly, when we discovered that DDT and other insecticides could control mosquito populations, we spread them everywhere. This not only harmed wildlife and beneficial insects, but also created perfect conditions for natural selection. How do microbes acquire antibiotic resistance? In drawing A, we see that random mutations make a few cells resistant. When challenged by antibiotics, only those cells survive and give rise to a resistant colony. Drawing B demonstrates how the resistance can move from one species to another. Sexual reproduction, or conjugation, of plasmid transfer moves genes from one strain or species to another. The heaviest burden of illness is borne by the poorest people, who can afford neither a healthy environment nor adequate health care. The World Health Organization estimates that 90% of all disease burden occurs in developing countries, where less than 1/10 of all healthcare dollars are spent. The group Médecins Sans Frontières, MSF, or Doctors Without Borders, calls this the 1090 gap. Dr. Jeffrey Sachs of Columbia University Earth Institute says that disease is as much a cause as a consequence of poverty and political unrest. More charities in wealthy countries, such as the Gates Foundation, need to step up and help eradicate diseases in developing countries. Lack of access to health care in the United States, where many poor people are denied access to government-paid health care, also contributes to poor health here in the United States. In summary, Environmental health focuses on external factors that cause disease. Major sources of environmental health risk are infectious agents, trauma, pollution, toxins, and radiation. Infectious agents remain the most common and the most deadly. Emergent diseases are those not previously known or that have been absent for at least 20 years. These include Ebola, Zika, and many others. As ecological diseases are found in animals, they may eventually become emergent diseases.